welcome everyone.
Hey, welcome, welcome. And as we get set up, just a quick few housekeeping notes. We have the chat disabled for today's webinar. However, we do have the Q&A option open, and that is at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on your phone, there's a little Q&A button that you can access and add any questions, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. And also we have captions enabled, so you should see a CC button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're joining us via phone, go in the settings and enable closed captioning, and then you can access it there. So welcome everybody. We'll get started in a few minutes once everybody files on in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessie. And just a reminder for folks who often are unable to maintain their energy for the whole duration of the conversation, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you need to come back and watch something later or share with your friends who were unable to join us live today, remember that our Solve M.E Facebook channel, which is YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/solvemecfs. Wonderful. I see the joins seem to have slowed down, so it looks like everyone's gotten their technological audio and video working pretty well. So I think we're okay to get started.
Fantastic, great. Well, again, just a note to add any questions you have in the Q&A, and I will pass it on to Oved Amitay to get us started.
Thank you, Jessie, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to get together today. The title of our conversation is Harnessing the Power of Community for Progress in the Fight Against ME/CFS. And as we were reflecting on the past year and a half or so since the COVID-19 pandemic started, a number of things started to become clear. The first one is that the world today is extremely connected, and it's connected in ways that we probably could not have seen before this pandemic. It's connected in ways that are way more complex than we probably could tell. And of course, this connectivity has a lot of implications, and I think that when I look at how different societies, different countries, different organizations, and different communities went through the pandemic up until this point, it's clear that those communities who could come together and work together fared better. And it's clear that this extreme connectivity, interconnectivity that the world offers to us these days is a source of power, if you can really harness that power and work together. And so when we look at that and we think about our community before COVID, the ME/CFS community, and perhaps some of the other comorbidities or related diseases, we could have been more connected. And now with COVID, this was really in many ways an opportunity not only for all of us to get closer, but also to work closely with a new community that started to become part of our world as a result of COVID-19. And by that I mean the long COVID or long haulers community. And so as we were thinking about what is our role as an organization, Solve has always had the goal of supporting and working towards treatments and cures for ME, ME/CFS, and that hasn't changed. And in many ways, that goal has been is now more important than ever. because of the growing need and the larger number of people who now have symptoms that are very similar to what we know as ME as a result of COVID-19. So that is just to say that for all of us to come together and work more closely and find the ways for us to have this power and harness the power of the community that's coming together is really more important than ever. And we've been trying to do that in two main areas. All of them really geared towards ultimately finding treatments and finding a cure. And that is through research and through advocacy. And these are the things that we continue to do with a growing community. So we'll talk about the research side in a couple of weeks. We'll have another opportunity to dedicate more time to that specifically and discuss how the registry as a platform allows us to harness this power of a larger group of people, a larger data set in the context of what's known as the big data revolution. And how can we harness that towards identifying targets, identifying ways to develop treatments and ultimately a cure. But today we'll focus on the efforts around advocacy. And the world has changed dramatically, obviously over the past few months, but also really had given our community an opportunity to advocate in a way that we did not have in the past. So today we'll talk more about that. These are still efforts that they're ongoing. There's no end in sight to where we need to go. So we need to continue to push forward. But there's been a lot of progress. So Emily will share with us more about some of the accomplishments. Some of them we discussed already that happened towards the end of last year. But there's been a lot of progress since then. We wanted to share some insights from the Advocacy Week and really what are some of the outcomes that came about as a result of a broader community coming together. That is the ME/CFS community, other post-viral diseases, and specifically the long COVID community, and how those efforts are now beginning to get results that really make us very hopeful that there's a significant breakthrough that can really translate into, as I said, treatments and ultimately a cure. So Emily, why don't you take this away? We wanted this to be a little bit more of a conversation. So there are some things that you wanted to share, but we'll invite obviously the people on the webinar and the call to present questions, and we'll take them later as they come in. You're muted, Emily.
I know that you're muted, the word of 2020. Thank you so much, Oved. I'm really excited to have this conversation, both with you and members of our community. I just wanted to also say thank you because this is a rare opportunity. You and I have had this conversation in just between the two of us about kind of how Solve M.E got to the position where we are with our congressional resources, with our community resources, with our political resources, and our political clout, if you will. And really excited to kind of share that conversation more publicly with the rest of our community, kind of how did we get here and how we're using what we've spent so much time and energy and money building to really to go to the next level, to really accelerate and elevate what we're able to accomplish. So I'm just going to dive right in. I have a short presentation prepared, but I really want to keep it tight because I want to really give this as an opportunity for us to, as Oved said, have a conversation and a dialogue and let time for your questions. So with that, we're going to dive right in. Jesse, if I can get the next slide, please. Wonderful. So, I don't know, Oved, if you knew this, but also if our community knew this, did you know that our advocacy program actually started before I was hired, before I became the first paid advocate for ME/CFS? I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
Oh, there you go. So today I learned. So Solve M.E's advocacy program actually began in 2015 as an emergency response to the defunding of the CDC's chronic fatigue syndrome program. And in early March 2015, back when Carol Head was the CEO of our organization, she was contacted by Mary Dimmick and other amazing MECFS advocates who had raised the alarm that for the first time in many years, the CDC's program was on the chopping block. It had been proposed for defunding. And in response to this, Solve ME became the founder of the US Action Working Group, which many folks on this call might be members of, which is an amazing group. If you're not familiar with them, definitely check out their website that has collected all of the MECFS advocates from across the country to coordinate and consolidate and work together. This created the rapid mobilization. That was the first time the MECFS community, to my knowledge, had traveled in with high-level representation to the US Senate. And this rapid response reaction over those several months resulted in the restoring of $5.4 million that had been on the chopping block in December of 2015. Next slide, please, Jesse. So that was actually the beginning of our program. And as a result of that experience, both Carol and the other advocates involved realized that this emergency response highlighted the need to have a federal specific advocate in the MECFS space. And so Carol put out the call, I answered the job interview, and here we are today. So that was 5 years ago now. And so I just wanted to kind of provide some context of what we've built over the past 5 years and why that puts us in a position to do so much more today. So as you see here, the very first action we did was preserving that CDC federal funding stream. And that has, to this day, has always been on the chopping block since that first day in 2015, that first budget proposal in 2015. So one of our primary goals here at the Solve ME advocacy program is preventing any more chopping of MECFS funding. So we've been very, very successful in that. In fact, we've been successful in increasing the budget at NIH over the past few years, with many others that have been contributing to that advocacy as well. But specific to the CDC funding, which has been, again, slated for defunding every year, we've been successful in restoring $38.8 million over the past 4 years in MECFS funding that would not have otherwise been preserved if it hadn't been for our intensive advocacy work on the appropriations process. So a lot of our work that you don't see is the work where we prevent bad things from happening. And if they don't happen, you never hear about them. Our next big accomplishment really came the following year, where we had the Mighty 55. To date, I believe this is the most numerically members of Congress that have ever come together on an MECFS action. And that would include both senators and members of the House. And they all came together to sign a letter to NIH that was led by our team to strengthen MECFS research. And you may have noticed that actually did see big results. From 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019, you see a steady increase in MECFS funding at NIH, even though in recent times, especially this year, we are expecting that to decline because of other priorities, which we all know is 2020 was a year that kind of upset a lot of different processes. Next, in 2017, we launched the initiative to include MECFS and defense funding. For those of you who've been following our work, this is what's called the CDMRP program, or the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. It took us 2 years of intensive lobbying, but we were successful in 2019 and were able to insert MECFS into that funding process. We also organized the first ever Advocacy Week on Capitol Hill that year and hosted our first ever Discovery Forum, which paved the way for the NIH Scientific Conference in 2019. It was a bit of a proof of concept with the NIH that we were able to fund independently in order to get NIH to step up and get to the table. That was all 2017. In 2018, one of our big victories was the first national resolution for MECFS, which was S225, which passed unanimously in the Senate, acknowledging MECFS International Awareness Day. And then in 2019, of course, the NIH conference, and that was the first year we saw funding come out of our initiative with the Department of Defense. Over $500,000 in grants were given to the Open Medicine Foundation as a result of our work in the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. And then in 2020, of course, our biggest victory yet is we were part of the effort to get $1.15 billion secured for long-term COVID-19 research, which we know some of that is going to head into ME/CFS inherently. As we know, there are cases of ME/CFS currently being triggered by COVID. And additionally, I just want to highlight, there's some confusion. Sometimes people say 1.15 or 1.25 billion. And the reason that is because there's a separate $100 million in that initiative that is specifically for post-viral diagnostics or post-COVID diagnostics. And that was an element of the language that we were directly responsible for inserting in order to, as we saw it, start peeling the onion of long COVID. Which long COVID cases are ME/CFS? Which long COVID cases are maybe something different? We don't know until we invest in diagnostic development, which is why that $100 million specifically for that area is so exciting for our team. So that's just kind of a quick recap of some of our accomplishments, but that represents over 5 years of intensive work. Those are many, many hundreds of folks making phone calls, thousands and thousands of messages to members of Congress from folks like you. All of the tools and training that we've done over these years that created these victories was all about empowering you, the community, and connecting you to people in power. Next slide, please, Jesse. And this, of course, brings us to sort of the hallmark program, the capstone program, whatever term you'd like to use, to the gold star program of our advocacy initiatives is Advocacy Week. This is our 5th annual Advocacy Week this year in 2021, and the last 2 years have been entirely digital because of the pandemic. And we saw, and we're learning, that these digital systems are really, really powerful for connecting people with ME/CFS who, as everyone on this call knows, have a lot of complications with travel, with energy levels, with management. So going physically to DC is really impossible for so many people. And thanks to these, I mean, in some parts, thanks to the pandemic, and thanks for the opening of our minds to remote participation collectively, that's resulted in, you see these increasing numbers that we saw in 2020 and 2021 because those digital participation was so powerful. And we really hope that we can continue to fight for this in our congressional offices, even after the pandemic becomes hopefully a distant memory, that we maintain some of the positive outcomes, like allowing for digital participation with members of Congress, which we hope that will continue in the future, and we're going to lobby hard for that. So that just gives you a kind of picture of our hallmark program, which really has led to so many of the successes you saw on the previous slide. Next slide, please, Jesse. So, and then 2020 happened, right? We were really on such a great track. And so 2020, I'd like to try to focus on some of the positives, but also acknowledge a lot of the challenges and changes that has happened as a result of the pandemic. Obviously, the funding, $1.15 billion, was a huge benefit that came out of the very end of 2020. But what changed for our community as a result of the pandemic? And again, is continuing to change as a result of the pandemic. Obviously, the first element is the massive increase in cases of ME/CFS, specifically folks that are getting ME/CFS diagnoses as a diagnosis as a result of their COVID-19 infection. So that has really started to shift the conversation of what ME/CFS looks like, because there are folks, many folks, that have joined our community, unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 infection. Also, evolving communication needs. How do we talk to our community about inclusion and diversity, as a lot of what we think of representation has changed in the past year, really, and as a result of many of the shifts culturally and financially in 2020. The conversation about post-viral illnesses in general. This has been a really interesting development in the Capitol Hill political world, and also in our public dialogue as a nation. Suddenly, after a massive viral infection that has impacted so many people in our country, people are suddenly acknowledging, and for the first time really embracing, the fact that a virus doesn't necessarily end its damage at the day it's cleared of your body. We knew this already in the ME/CFS community, as many people, about 80% of people with ME/CFS report that an infection was the triggering event that caused their illness. And now that's being sort of accepted and developed in our national dialogue as part of what needs to be a broader public health conversation. Also in 2020, our budget process got flipped upside down. This is partially due to, as you can see, the last bullet point there, contentious partisanship and a lot of the intensive developments that have really created a great divide in the positions of power due to the party dynamics in DC right now. And that is continuing through 2021, but it has really changed the way that we as advocates have to do business because the budget process is no longer as open as it used to be. And so we need to find different access points and different elements of the conversation, which in some degree, as I just talked about our success for the past 5 years, have been building those relationships at certain key entry points of the budget process. But now, due to the hyper-partisanship in DC, the budget process has completely changed, which means we now have to go and develop new relationships for new access points, which are actually more restrictive than they were prior to 2020. The last two items I just wanted to feature in terms of what changed is access to care, which was both helped and simultaneously hurt by the pandemic. So many patients were unable to get the care they need due to COVID protocols, and yet simultaneously the opening up of telehealth and the opening up of remote digital participation, like we're doing right now, suddenly became far more acceptable in the medical field. So how can we as advocates both preserve the parts that helped our community while simultaneously shedding the layers of COVID protocols that hurt our community? And then lastly is, I just have to feature this enough, public awareness. I know there's a lot of contention in the community about how we talk about long COVID and the conversation broadly about long COVID, but the idea being that this conversation about long COVID and the public awareness about long COVID is happening whether or not MECFS is at the table. So our options are as advocates to either step out of the conversation and let long COVID take its own shape or its own form without our voices being heard, or to step into the conversation. And even though there are people with long COVID who probably don't fit an MECFS case criteria definition, but there are many, many more who do. And so if our voices as the MECFS community are not bringing that knowledge, bringing that viewpoint, bringing the experience of our community into these conversations, we see that as a terrible lost opportunity, because we would get left in the dust if it weren't for us stepping forward proactively to insert ourselves into these broader conversations about post-viral illness. Next slide, please, Jesse. So that brings us to where we are today. And this is my last slide because, like I said, I really want to save as much time for questions as possible. Where we are in the present. So I chose to highlight 3 efforts that are currently ongoing right now. These are not the only 3 efforts we're working on. As I mentioned before, appropriations, agency level advocacy, and we're also in the process of writing a letter to an open letter to all levels of leadership in the agencies and executive branch, meaning the Biden administration. But so all of those efforts, I don't want to gloss over them, but I do think these are the 3 efforts I'd like to highlight for folks to see how we're pulling our existing MECFS investments into new levels of success. And I'll also highlight, I saw a question came in very early on, and the question was, what is the future of HR 7057, which you may remember from 2020, which was an MECFS specific research funding bill, the first of its kind ever. And if we're talking about reviving it, and that's a great question. And the reason why I want to highlight that, even though I wasn't planning on speaking about it right now, is that the dollar amount for HR 7057 was $15 million. And a lot of people balked at that figure in the government. They felt it was too high. Meanwhile, our community knew it was way too low. And so when we talk about whether or not we want to reinvent that opportunity, I say no, because $15 million, although it's substantial, there is much, much bigger money on the table right now that we have an opportunity to go for. And so when we're thinking about, as our small team targets where we can invest our energy and time to get the best bang for our buck, I think these 3 areas are going to be the best financial investment, because we'll get the best return on investment in terms of what we can invest, in terms of what we get out of those investments. So really quickly, the first one is HR 2754, which many of you have probably seen lots of emails about in the one-click action kit. This is titled the COVID-19 Long Haulers Act. And I know a lot of folks were concerned, but I don't judge a book by its cover. Likewise, don't judge a bill by its title. HR 275, I think, would be more appropriately titled the Post-Infectious Illness Long Hauler Act, because the way we helped write that language is very broad, not specific to only COVID-19 post-infectious illness, but looking at sort of a cross-section of areas that are impacted by post-infectious illness. Those three sections are medical education, racial and geographic disparities, and data harmonization. And as you heard Oved describe, and as you've heard many of our including our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Sadie Whitaker, describe, we really believe here at Solve M.E that big data is the answer to a lot of the complex questions of ME/CFS. So I personally want to take a moment to highlight the area of data harmonization in this bill, because in one way, it's a little bit my baby. I really very passionate about it. And in one way, I think it's the singular best opportunity we have to find answers about preventative factors and treatments. And what this section does is it breaks down the barriers, or funds a process that will break down the barriers between a lot of the data silos that currently exist. We're hearing from researchers that they're frustrated that they can't get access to certain types of data. For example, what are the long-term outcomes of people who got vaccinated, especially people who already had chronic illness that got vaccinated? What are the vaccination rates? What are the follow-up rates for people who did get a COVID-19 infection? How often then they visit the medical office after their infection resolved? These are questions, and this is data, rich, robust data sets that are all isolated in different parts of our public health system right now. Some of those pieces of data are in state and local public health providers. Some of those pieces of data are in private funders like Blue Shield and Blue Cross and Kaiser that have robust data sets. Some of those pieces of data are in the CMS or Medicaid and Medicare services have access to that data for those populations. But they're all in these like little silos and no one's bringing them together, not to mention private agencies or private entities like Solve M.E, like Dysautonomia International, like the Patient-Led Research Consortium that are doing their own research. And we're sharing that data in amongst ourselves, but how do we share it with the big dogs, right? Like how do we get this so it's cross-cutting, that we can pull on that data just the same way they can pull on ours? So that piece I just take a moment to really dig into, because I'm very enthusiastic about the data harmonization component of HR 2754. Other elements that this bill does, it also, as I mentioned, funds medical education. It funds investigation and research into post-infectious illness disparities, meaning barriers to access service as a post-infectious illness patient that is not specific to long COVID. And the other element that is very subtle in the bill, but I think is really powerful, it actually funds the expansion of the current chronic illness tracking database to include long COVID, ME/CFS, and other post-infectious illnesses as well that are currently not included in that database. So I'm really excited about this piece of legislation, again, with just under $100 million price tag. That brings us to the Centers of Excellence Act. This has not yet been introduced, so there is no bill number, but we are working collaboratively with another consortium that represents academic medical research centers. So this bill has a much bigger price tag, which I'm very excited about. It's $860 million over 5 years to fund 15 centers of excellence that are open and including long COVID and ME/CFS. They provide research, clinical care, and medical education. Those are the three pieces that have to be present in order to define a center of excellence. And most excitingly, it creates an overview board that oversees all of these centers. And thanks to our participation and collaboration with these teams, ME/CFS can have a seat at the table in the how and why of these funding centers. The centers are funded at $10 million per center for the first year and $5 million of continuing money for each center for up to 5 years following. So we're very excited about that piece of legislation, because we feel that as we often talk about creating research infrastructure in the ME/CFS space, and that this is exactly what the NIH tried to do with the CRCs, or the Consortium Research Centers that were funded in 2016, this could be the next generation, the stronger generation, the much better funded generation of comprehensive collaborative research centers. Last but not least, the mechanism through which we've been doing a lot of this work, and we are proud to be a founding member of the Long COVID Alliance. For those who haven't been familiar with this group that we're really excited to have, you're welcome to join. You can go to the website, which is longcovidalliance.org, and check out our work and publications. We now have over 350 partners as part of this organization. It is patient-led. It focuses, we are a collection of both individuals, patients with chronic illnesses and post-COVID illnesses, and nonprofit organizations like ourselves, and companies and for-profit partners, and as if we were there, and medical providers and doctors themselves, and researchers and scientists. So it really is a big tent that we're building with the intention of doing three things. First, our goal is to collectivize, to bring together all of the knowledge base we have from post-infectious illnesses so that we're not recreating the wheel. It was a big concern that when big chunks of money start flowing out the federal government's doors for these research, everybody comes to try and get a piece of the pie. And we want to emphasize that we don't want to repeat all of the studies on ME/CFS that we've already done for the past 30 years on people with long COVID. There's no point to repeating those studies. We want new studies with new comparison groups that are moving the field forward. So one of the primary purposes of the Long COVID Alliance is to collect all of this knowledge from all of the post-infectious illness communities and bring that to the forefront of the conversation. So we're not going backwards, we're going forwards. The second element of the Long COVID Alliance is, as everyone knows, education and awareness. Even the CDC doctor who testified at the long COVID hearing did not know the term post-exertional malaise. And he's the government expert testifying in front of Congress about the impact of this illness and did not know the name for the primary symptom. So obviously we still have lots of work to do in education, but the Long COVID Alliance has been exceptional in raising the storytelling, the media awareness, and the correct talking points scientifically around how we speak about these illnesses. Last but not least, of course, as everyone knows, research, research, research. We are so thrilled to be making so many fantastic connections. In fact, a publication just came out this week, which was partly responsible from the Long COVID Alliance, that Vinex collaborated with the Canadian COVID long haulers team to do a patient-led research study about the impact of COVID and specifically long COVID in Canada. And that was in part due to us bringing these folks together. Again, it's so important that we create a space in which ME/CFS can be part of the conversation. So last but not least, building this alliance and this cross-issue support, which we are very excited about the success there. So those are just the three areas that I wanted to highlight. There's plenty more work that we can share and talk about, but again, I wanted to get to your questions. So without further ado, that's sort of a sense of where we were, where we are, and Oved, if you'd like to share with us a little bit more about where we hope to go.
Thank you, Emily. I think maybe we'll take a few questions and then we'll come back to kind of where we want to go. Does that work? Because I think there are some really important questions related to some of the topics you just described.
Absolutely.
All right.
Which question should we tackle first? I know there's quite a few.
Yeah, I think. Well, you already talked about the previous House Resolution 7057, but could you speak more to the prospects for the new proposed bill, the 2754 one, and how do you see the timeline for that? What should we all expect? And of course, it's always difficult to predict those kind of things, but where do you see this bill going? And in a related question, what can the community do to help with the activities around that right now?
Excellent question, and thank you so much, John, for that question. Really appreciate it. So HR 2754 is currently just been introduced, and our language is still navigating its way through what we call Leg Council or Legislative Council and the clerk's office. They're sort of the team that is independent, nonpartisan, that is responsible for sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, making sure that there's nothing in the law that conflicts with another law that may have already been written. So we're currently in that process, and it takes a couple of weeks for the legislative language to be blessed by that team to make sure we sort of get the hurdle of is it possible, is it feasible, and is it not going to create conflicts? So that's where we are in terms of the process right now. Once we clear that, and that's why the action that people are taking right now, and those of you who participated in advocacy this year probably saw the email that we sent out with your next step. So that action that's associated to our current place right now is asking existing members to co-sponsor the legislation. So we were really excited when the legislation got introduced because we had two surprise co-sponsors, a Republican and a Democrat. And so we currently have 4 official co-sponsors, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. What we'd like to see is to build that up as much as possible. Obviously, if you're a co-sponsor of a bill, you have a vested interest in making sure it's successful. So the more co-sponsors we can get, the better, for many, many reasons, and that's one of them. So right now, if you had received that email, if you haven't, we'd be happy to send you. It's a sample email that you can just copy and paste and send to your member of Congress that asks your member to co-sponsor the bill. That's where we are right now. Once we clear Ledge Council and the full language and text is up, we're probably going to shift to a two-pronged strategy. The first is we're looking for a Senate companion. Obviously, as that things move faster when you can do both the House and Senate together. Otherwise, you have to bunny hop from the House to the Senate, and that sort of doubles your timeline. So we're trying to expedite the process by getting a Senate version introduced at the same time. We're still looking for a Senate Republican who's interested in co-sponsoring this legislation at the Senate level. So if you live in a district with a friendly Senate Republican who might be interested in working with some Senate Democrats on a Senate version of this bill, we'd love to talk to you to see how we can help you with that conversation with your senator. But in the meantime, in the House, still looking for co-sponsors. Once those 2 actions happen, we'll be referred to committee. That brings us to the next step of the process. So that at that stage, we'll be looking for either members who serve on that committee to speak to them, to get them excited to support the bill. Or we'll also be looking for members to write the committee to encourage the committee to take up the bill. So we're not there yet, but I expect probably in the July timeframe, we'll be entering into that phase of our advocacy, looking for committee folks to take up. And yes, thank you for the reminder, Jesse. Jesse just shared in the chat, in the Q&A, the link to the action kit. So this is the wonderful part about some of the tools we provide and our investment in the community, is it's not just about me speaking to members of Congress, but it's much more powerful for you to speak to your members of Congress, which is why we put together the action toolkit. It's actionkit21.com. The link right there was in the chat. And if you go to that, we've made it really easy. Every action in itself takes about between 5 and 15 minutes, and they're broken up by category. So you can take any of them as often as you want, as many times as once a week. You can do each of those actions. And that's a really easy way for you to just click the button, make a phone call, everything's self-contained there, so that you can take just 15 minutes of your week every week to make a real big impact. So the final stage, once we get through both legislative council, committee markup, then we're going to start working on what we would call like high-level packaging. This is where we are, once we clear committee, it's pretty rare for bills to get passed in a standalone form anymore, unless they're particularly bipartisan or have a particularly powerful member behind them. Most bills are kind of clumped together in a package. You may have heard the term omnibus, which is often referred to what they do when they do a budget version of clumping things together. So we're looking for different opportunities. And as I say, we're tracking 2 bills that are both very different in the way they approach, but they approach the same problem. And our goal is to hopefully push all these things together in a centralized long COVID package. And we are, not to tip our hat too much, but we are eyeing the upcoming infrastructure package as maybe a vehicle through which we can insert our bills for final passage. So in terms of what that whole timeline looks like, I talk about 3 different elements of that process. I'm hoping the first element will probably take hold around July. August recess, we lose a month, come back in September. Budget conversations are really intense, so hopefully we'll try to push ourselves through and without getting bogged down too much by the budget, which is going to be late anyways this year. And then that'll bring us to the final cycle. So if all things go well and we really hit very few barriers, we might be able to pass as early as 2022. That's the goal. And that's what we've written into the language. Everything is with the intention of implementation in 2022. If not, we'll have to go back to the drawing board and reintroduce to get a rewrite to get a 2023 timeframe. But that's hopefully where we're aiming for in terms of timeline.
That's great. I mean, maybe at the end we'll share again some of the specific ways that people can engage to have an impact on this process. So I wanted to maybe take a moment, and I'll start by answering Court's question about the NIH grants. And of course, Emily, you mentioned the really huge success of getting 1.15 billion to the NIH specifically for long COVID and in post-viral disease research. What's the status of that? So yes, the first round of applications went out back in February, and the NIH really is looking to start awarding some of those grants. We just heard in the last couple of days that the first awards went out, are going out. And at this point, the information that we have is really specifically for a small number of institutions. All of them, as far as I can tell, are academic institutions that will receive funding to basically create what the NIH calls the core centers or the core capabilities. And these will be the centers that ultimately will enable collection of larger building and connecting larger cohorts of patients and information and research that will come after that. So that's kind of where we are. I expect that over the next couple of weeks we'll know more, and we'll see what other ways the NIH will be spending the money. It looks like their approach, in my mind, is the right one, which is really to create a what the NIH calls a cohort of cohorts. Meaning trying to leverage a number of different research activities that were already ongoing, such as the registry our registry that we've mentioned, which does have people with ME as well as people with long COVID in it already. So that's the approach that they're taking, and so we've just begun to see the first awards going out, and we'll obviously keep the community updated on what else is going on. And I think this will allow other people to enter this space, researchers and organizations that have not been involved in this kind of study before. So to answer the question about can we hope for new ideas and new players, I think the answer is yes. And that leads me maybe to address Michael's question about other agencies.
Oved, before you move on, can I just add one more point on that?
Sure.
I just want to add that the cohort of cohorts that Oved described is called the Recover cohort. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about that particular project, it just went live on the web today. So the website is recovercovid.org. And that's the NIH project, as Oved described that, if you want to learn more information about that.
Great, and again, I think that this is, from a research perspective, that's going to be the opportunity for everyone to understand the first steps after an infection takes place, and what happens, and why do some people recover, and why do some people continue to have longer term symptoms. That is the kind of research that we were never able to do up until now in the context of ME. So that's really an incredible aspect of the research that needs to be done right now. So, well, there you go. So it was posted today, and it looks like there is progress. We're a few months into this, but I expect to see an acceleration of those grants over the next few weeks. The other point I think we wanted to talk about, Emily, you mentioned our approach to reach out to other agencies. And so we were very focused initially on the NIH. Obviously, that's the largest research agency that exists. But we're looking at a number of other agencies, and the plan is to approach others. I'll mention a few, and Emily, you can expand on that. The first one is obviously the CDC, which has the mandate to disseminate medical information. And of course, that's something that we look up to the CDC to continue to do, both on on post-viral diseases, long COVID, and ME/CFS. Again, this is the opportunity now to reach out to a much larger number of clinicians that need to be aware of post-viral diseases. And so that's a unique opportunity. I'll mention the FDA, which is an agency that I think will play a critical role in the coming months and over the next couple of years, primarily for two reasons. We are obviously we had this amazing breakthrough with vaccines that were approved, but there is still a large program to continue and follow people who are vaccinated, the impact of that, and also people who got infected although they were vaccinated. And it will be important to understand if any of them, some of them, or a lot more of them go on to develop long COVID or other post-viral diseases. So there's a lot of information that the FDA will have access to and the ability to look at, and that's going to be incredibly important. But perhaps more importantly is also the FDA's role in looking at treatment options and beginning to use some of the experience that we've had with some drugs that were used or are being used for ME/CFS and do benefit some patients. And it will be very important to leverage this knowledge and apply that to other clinical studies. So these are some agencies that we're looking at. There are a number of other quasi-government agencies like PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Research Outcome Institute. I think I got it.
Yep, that's it.
Right. Which is an agency that really is focused on patient research. So there are a number of those organizations and agencies that will play a role, and our plan is to engage all of them. So I mean, maybe you want to say a few more things about that.
I have really nothing to add. You hit all of the big ones. FDA, CDC, and PCORI are some big ones. The only one I would add, and this is a sort of recent development, we've been, thanks to our work with the Long COVID Alliance, we've been connected to a working group of state medical education leaders. So these are state departments of health that are responsible for certifying medical professionals in their state. And we're working on collaborating with them to create a medical information packet or medical education packet that we can share with them through that. So again, I think what I find, I just like to highlight the beauty of working with multiple communities is that you have access to kind of all of those folks' Rolodex, right? And when you identify a common problem that you share with another community, you can collaborate with their resources to have those entry points. So I love how you describe kind of pseudo-government agencies because there are state level agencies, local level agencies, and of course other nonprofits at a high level. You think of people like the American Academy for Pediatrics, right? That is an entity that is not government funded and yet does have its own bureaucracy and power like a government agency. So so I just, as much as we focus on the government agencies, which, as we should, I'd also like to highlight that there are these non-government actors that can also be really great allies and powerful entities of change.
That's great. So we'd like to address Cynthia's question about the Centers of Excellence legislation and kind of the prospects for that. This is one that I think we all feel is incredibly important to address all those other dimensions in addition to the scientific research, but really to provide this holistic care for people. What is your view on the timing and prospects for this legislation?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that question, Cynthia. I'm very optimistic and excited about the Centers of Excellence legislation, primarily because the driving force behind it is a coalition of academic medical centers led by the Association of Academic Medical Centers in New York. And they are a powerhouse of government entry points and of strong advocacy, because they do represent, the hospitals that are primarily on the front line. And I'm so pleased that, our organization, or our alliance, as a predominantly patient-led organization, really just was such a perfect yin to their yang. They had so much strength in that academic medical side, and yet we can bring the patient experience and sort of the in the trenches world of when these two worlds meet. And so I'm really excited about this legislation. First of all, because of the price tag. I have not seen a bill outside of our $1 billion with this much investment in medical and post-infectious medical infrastructure, which I think is where we will definitely see the most benefit, not just for our immediate needs of getting people well and getting people access to the care they need, but for our long-term needs of growing this field. In many years, we've talked about, and the NIH often gives us pushback, that we don't have enough researchers or enough clinicians interested in this field to give out money. And they kind of give us this smokescreen that, well, we're only receiving 5 applications or 10 applications, so we can't fund any more than the applications we receive. And so I really see the Centers of Excellence both as a short-term Band-Aid to fix the need for medical care now, but also a long-term infrastructure investment, so that we're building research infrastructure that will carry us past this immediate crisis and into future positive outcomes for post-infectious illness. So that's one of the reasons I'm really excited about it. It will be introduced, the timeline is to be introduced in the House on June 14th, and I believe the Senate companion bill is coming together as well, and it would be introduced in the Senate at that same time. So, so that's why the opportunity to speak to your members now about the Centers of Excellence is a little too early, because it hasn't been introduced yet. But after June 14th, which coincidentally is both Oved and my birthday, we will see. That's the best birthday gift I think we could possibly ask for, is $860 million of research funding. Really excited about that. And so once it's introduced, we'll definitely share additional congressional support and ways you can get involved. And similar to our bill, the process, the process to skin a cat is somewhat the same. It'll start with a co-sponsorship outreach, move into a congressional committee outreach, and then hopefully pass into the full floor. So, so we have been waiting for these Centers of Excellence for decades. And I want to be clear that these Centers of Excellence are not exclusive to MECFS, but they will include MECFS, and we'll make sure that, because of the seat at the table that's built into the bill for our advocacy. And that's one element I'd like to really highlight. The other element of this our work in this area that I'd also like to feature is the emphasis and the inclusion of patients in research. I think that's the other element that makes this bill very unique, is that it is inherent in the way the bill is written that there is patient incorporation at every level of the creation of these centers. And that's something we haven't really seen in most big investment projects in the research space in the past. So, so those are two elements that I think lend me to be very optimistic about this bill. And then in terms of what we can do as a community for our next steps, pretty much as I described, everything we've been doing now, but the big hurdle with this bill is going to come because of its price tag. It is expensive. $850 million is not chump change. And there is an appropriations request being led by Representative Velasquez to support that funding. So that's probably going to be where we're really going to need your support. And that's going to be in the next, I'd say, 4 to 5 months, when we're going to need to push the appropriations process forward, because getting the money behind this bill is just as important as getting the bill itself passed.
Great. So maybe one more question on the Long Hauler Act, and that is there parity, or in other words, does the legislation distinguishes between people who now have an ME/CFS diagnosis as a result of COVID, as opposed to someone who had ME/CFS prior to that? Is there a distinction between the two, or will the Long Hauler Act essentially, as you said, will address all the long haulers, irrespective of the origin of their condition?
Again, a great question, Cynthia. Thank you for that. Because the bill has different sections, the answer to that question is different for each section. So for the section regarding AHRQ, which looks at disparities, it looks at all disparities and barriers to access for all post-infectious illnesses. So that is ME/CFS included, but not ME/CFS exclusive. So that's going to look at lots of different barriers to accessing care that our patient community and other patient communities experience. The section on CDC likewise specifies ME/CFS as an included topic area of the medical education programs, but also specifies Guillain-Barré, mast cell activation, dysautonomia, and POTS, and I'm missing one that I can't remember, and hypermobility disorders, all of those that are triggered or inflamed by viral infections. So that piece is very specific, and ME/CFS is one of the items specified. Regarding the CMS expansion, I believe that is also like the first, all post-infectious illnesses, and in that case, it's specific to post-infectious chronic illnesses. So it is kind of a more narrow definition, but still ME/CFS inclusive. And our last section at PCORI is about data harmonization across all of the data spaces. So in that sense, again, it does not specify ME/CFS, but it specifies funding data collaboratives that bring highlighted data together. So that would include both ME/CFS data, dysautonomia and POTS data, all of those other comorbid conditions. I'm hoping through our advocacy after the bill is passed to also fight to have endometriosis included. And this is sort of a unique area that I think some of the women on the call would be very familiar with. That endometriosis is a chronic illness in which the cells of your reproductive system keep growing, and it creates a lot of challenges with pain, it creates a lot of challenges with fertility, and previous studies show that 30% of women with endometriosis will get ME/CFS. So we know there's a connection there, and I'd like to see that added into the data collection to see if maybe we can start peeling that onion and find out what's with that 30% who also get ME/CFS. Is there something there that can be preventative? Because I know there's a lot of really interesting drugs in development for endometriosis, and if they can be preventing ME/CFS in 30% of women who get that disease, that would be an amazing, amazing discovery. So, anyways, that's just my personal take on that. But those are the different pieces and how ME/CFS is incorporated at the different levels.
Great. So, Emily, I know we're coming almost to the end of our time today, but this has been fascinating. Maybe I'll just ask you one more question as we get closer to the end of our time today. You've been an advocate for a long time. Coming out of this really difficult year and a half, are you more optimistic? Are you less optimistic, or has that not changed in terms of your thoughts about all these efforts becoming successful to really make a change in the care and ultimately the treatment for people with ME/CFS and other post-viral diseases?
Great question, Oved. I am definitely far more optimistic than I was at the end of 2019, than I am here at the end of 2020, the beginning of or midpoint of 2021. I hate the fact that COVID has cost so many lives. I hate the fact that COVID has taken so much from both myself, our families, our country. But I love the fact that we're finally open and having conversations that we should have been having for the past 30 years. And I love the fact that COVID has shined a bright, penetrating spotlight on so many of these critical issues, especially around complex chronic illnesses and viral triggered illnesses like ME/CFS. And so I'm definitely more optimistic. The three things that I'd say out of this tragedy have been the reasons for me being so optimistic is one, the legitimization. I was blown away in the transition between our reception in Congress from 2019 to 2021. In 2019, it felt like we were still fighting the battle about psychologicalization. We were still fighting the battle about the PACE trial. Like, it felt like we were still proving our legitimacy. And then COVID overnight made us very legitimate, and not just legitimate, but sort of the leaders in the field. And I can definitely say from being the front line of these conversations that with COVID, we went from like fighting our way into the big leagues to now we are centralized in this conversation in the big leagues. So all of that investment I talked about, those 5 years of hard work from 2015 to 2020, where we were building those relationships, building that legitimacy, building that access points, all paid off because we were perfectly positioned to be the center of the conversation now about this issue. So I'm really thrilled about that. The second thing I would bring to my optimism is obviously the research funding. I mean, we have literally 35 years of research funding airdropped into the NIH in a single day to suddenly focus on exactly the areas of research we needed to focus on. And, you know, with money, it's like sharks smelling blood, comes all of the big interest groups that we have been courting for decades. And suddenly with $1 billion on their table, they're very interested in speaking to us, which is really lovely. It's kicked open a lot of doors. And I'd say the last reason why I'm unfortunately optimistic about this is because it has it has broken down the barriers between our communities out of necessity. We at Solve M.E have always been ME/CFS first, center, and only. And yet we never talked to the POTS researchers, even though some of our best researchers like Dr. Peter Rowe are also experts in dysautonomia, and yet we never sort of tapped into that field. So for the first time as a field, both in the research space and in the advocacy space, we're reaching across these barriers that are simply no longer relevant. It's not important to us whether Peter Rowe is funded for ME/CFS or dysautonomia. Now it's important that we're all funded because all of us are seeing dynamic boosts in our patient numbers, and not just at Solve ME, which as folks may have seen the article from Dr. Tony Komaroff, which predicted a doubling in ME/CFS case numbers in the United States in the next 18 months. But similarly, our friends at dysautonomia, our friends at mast cell activation, our friends at Ehlers-Danlos are seeing similar bubbles in post-COVID cases. So that's allowed us to sort of break down the barriers between our research, between our data, and start doing collaborations that I really think will move the field forward much more rapidly than if we were doing it all independently. So that's the third reason I'm really optimistic, is that we are bringing these communities together, not just communities of patients, but communities of researchers, communities of scientists, communities of care providers that are all sharing notes for the first time, and it's long overdue.
Great. Well, Emily, thank you so much for sharing your optimism, which I certainly share with you as well. And but mostly to thank the community for really being such an incredibly important part of this effort. And as we started our conversation, it's really the harnessing of this power of coming together to make an impact. So we're committed to continue to do that, and obviously we'll keep you posted as we continue to do that. And hopefully we'll have more of these optimistic conversations in the coming months. So before we close, Jesse, maybe I'll just transition to you for closing comments.
Thank you, Oved. I just wanted to share, join our online community. That's a wonderful slide right there. We are in the middle of our $500,000 Double Your Money Challenge through the end of June. So if you are a fan of the work we're doing here at Solve ME, we could definitely use your dollars to build our capacity so we can do even more. So for those of you who already have donated, thank you, thank you, thank you. You are a lifeblood. And for those of you who are yet to donate, we hope you'll join our community. And last but not least, I'll just add that for those of you who are patients with ME/CFS, long COVID, or a related post-viral illness, do check out our You and Me registry plus our COVID study. Your data is just as valuable as your dollars. And if you share that data with us, we will then continue to advocate to make it part of the big data dream. And your involvement in sharing both your data and potentially your biosamples, such as blood or saliva, would be essential to all this research that we've been talking about funding. So if you have the time and you have the energy, we would definitely appreciate your interest and support. You can check it out at youandmeregistry.com.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Emily.
With that, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, and Emily, as our host, it is up to you to end this webinar, but check out the recording later on YouTube and of course on our Facebook. And thank you all for joining us.
Absolutely. And for those of you who would like any follow-up conversations or have any other questions, I recognized a lot of names on the chat, but feel free to email me. That's Taylor, ETAYLOR @solve, like solve a puzzle, cfs.org. So Taylor @solvecfs.org. Thank you all.